it's my pleasure to introduce Shierry Nicholsen. Shierry is a psychoanalyst in private practice on Capitol Hill with adults, adolescents, and couples. She did her training at Northwestern Psychoanalytic Society and Institute, and she's on the faculty at our institute and also at Psyche. She has a special interest in creativity and the arts. She's been stone sculpting for the past 10 years or so, and recently she's been working on the topic of free association in psychoanalysis. And when I think of Shierry, what I want to tell you is, when I was an English major, there was this mandate that was, make every word count. And I think in our analytic community, nobody embodies that quite as well as she does.
So before I start reading my paper, I have a few things to say. One is how very grateful I am to the EBOR organizing committee for giving me the opportunity to speak on this topic. It was very meaningful for me to observe my process and to put it into words in this way. The second thing is I want to say that in the background, as I read, will play a slideshow of some of my sculptures from the past 10 years. And each image will be there for a minute, which is a very long time. And the sequence of 15 images will play twice over the half an hour of my paper. So you may feel free to be in a state of reverie and listen to me and look at the images in a relaxed way. You don't need to jerk your attention around to make sure you catch the image, is what I'm trying to say. And these photographs were taken by Dean Glave, who many of you know, who was recently left Seattle. Yes, it looks like you can see them. Okay. So my paper is called Working with Stone, Working with Psyche, the Role of Reverie in the Process of Making Art and Psychoanalytic Work. My talk tonight is to give you a sense of reverie at work, both in the making of art and in analytic work with patients. I know that most of you here tonight are clinicians, but some of you are not. And so I will try to talk about reverie without referring to psychoanalytic theory or using technical terms. The rest of the conference will give you plenty of that. As you know, I'm both a stone sculptor and a psychoanalyst, and I have to also add that Sabah was my first teacher, and I vividly remember the time the light went on in me when he said, "Follow the line around." Oh! But he should not be held responsible for any of the limitations of my work. So for those of you who are clinicians, many of the things I say about the role of reverie in my stone work will immediately call up parallels in your minds to working with patients. And when I speak about reverie in analytic work, I will do it as an analogy to working with stone. In this way, I hope the similarities will become very clear. I think it is obvious to all of us that a piece of stone and a person are very different indeed, and so I won't tend to stress the differences. By stressing the analogies, I hope that the process of making art will become more understandable for the clinicians among you. We look at works of art, at least I do, and say in wonderment, how on earth did the artist do that? Well, I'm going to talk about how, and reverie is a very important part of that how. First, let me tell you briefly what I mean by reverie, and I know you've heard Karen and Dan's wonderful definitions, and I'm going to give a simple one. One thing to know about it right from the beginning is that reverie takes a personal form, so that another artist or clinician might mean something slightly different when they talk about it, because they experience reverie in a slightly different way. I think of reverie as an activity that goes on within a state of mind where the mind is relaxed but open and alert, and I am paying attention to what comes into my mind. The artists among you might think of inspiration when something comes into the mind unbidden. This is a dramatic version of what happens in reverie. The clinicians among you might think of the process of free association. In free association, we may experience what Freud referred to as an Einfall in German, literally something falling into the mind, like an inspiration, though not always so dramatic. Freud also talked about freie Assoziation, literally free association, where one thing leads to another to make a train of ideas, again unbidden. In terms of the analyst, Freud spoke of evenly hovering attention, where the analyst's relaxed and open mind catches the drift of the patient's free association. But the analyst also experiences things falling into the mind and ideas generating trains of association. What kinds of things it may be that fall into the mind or are generated within the mind and noticed is something I'll talk about a bit later. And of course, you'll have noticed that a stone and a sculptor are not exactly patient and analyst. The sculptor may experience things like the patient or like the analyst. I'm going to call all of that, both the state of mind and what comes into the mind in that state, reverie. Now I turn to the process of working with stone, and I'm going to take you through from the beginning to the end with an emphasis on the role of reverie. So, I have a chunk of stone, and I'm going to make something from it. How do I start? As you can see from the photos, the sculptures I make are not representational, they are abstract. They are evocative, they suggest things to the viewer, especially if the viewer can be in a state of reverie while looking at the piece. But they are not pictures of real things. They don't provide answers to the question, what's that supposed to be? Sometimes phrased as, what's that supposed to be? Since I'm not working representationally, I don't start from a specific picture in my mind, or say a drawing of what I want the sculpture to look like when it's finished. If every so often I misguidedly do that, it doesn't last very long once I'm into the process of working with the stone. But I do start with something outside myself, in this case a piece of stone. In clinical work too, we start with something, a prospective patient who comes to us for help. And even if we have fantasies about the ideal patient this new person could be, they usually don't last very long. So how do I start? I have this piece of stone, and I turn myself to it, so to speak. I contemplate it, moving around it with my eyes, and also turning it physically, on the lookout for some starting point. You could say, for some initial point of contact between my mind, or my psyche, I'll use the word mind in the large sense here, some point of contact between my mind and the stone. In other words, I try to put my mind in a state of reverie while I look at the stone, and I hope that something will emerge. It might be some time, sometimes even months, before this initial contact is made. And the same thing can happen, of course, with a prospective or a new patient. In the meantime, I'm turning the stone over in my gaze from time to time, not necessarily looking hard at any one spot, rather just letting its various aspects pass by my gaze, and probably by my touch as well. A little like the way Freud talks of free association as being like the passenger in the train, just looking at the window at what goes by. eventually something happens and the work has started. Something specific in the stone catches my attention and something emerges in my mind. It might be a rough curve I can sense in the stone, or a spot of color I hadn't noticed before, or a line of some kind I suddenly see that evokes something in me. Something in my own mind comes forward to meet that specific thing in the stone. How can this happen? If you think about it, as human beings living in bodies in a physical world, we have all experienced innumerable forms. And from this storehouse of forms in our minds, for some personal and probably unconscious reason, something comes forward. With the patient, this could happen right away. When, say, the patient brings an evocative dream, or we have a dream that night that feels connected with that patient. Or it might happen much later with some quite subtle feeling of something having passed between us, and we feel, now we've started. I've spent a lot of time talking about the beginning of the process, the initial engagement, because it gives you a good idea of something emerging in reverie. But what happens next? First, it's important to be aware that once the process is started, there's no way to say what comes next. As I said, I don't have an idea of what the piece will eventually look like, even though various images may float through my mind. All I know is that hopefully I will keep going with it until it becomes its own thing, what I like to call a being in its own right. It's similar with a patient. We don't know what the outcome will look like. We don't know who the patient will be when our work together has come to an end. But to return to the question, now that the work with the stone has begun, how does it go on? Many of you are familiar with Michelangelo's statement that the form is there in the stone, waiting to be freed by the sculptor. You will also remember that Freud says that analysis works not by via di ponere, but by via de levare, not by putting something on top of what was already there, not by putting something on top of what was already there, but by taking something away. In other words, not by covering something up, but by uncovering it. I've already said that I don't start with a vision of a form there to be freed. So what can this uncovering mean in terms of the work? First of all, in a very literal sense, in stone sculpture, all you can do is take stone away. You chisel or saw something off, or you file or sand something down. In terms of reverie, this means that what comes into your mind is something that is not actually there in the stone right now. Perhaps it's a gesture, say a sweeping upward, but it is a gesture that is not the exact equivalent of what is there at present. Stone will have to be taken away from the piece in order for me to see that gesture clearly embodied in the stone itself. In that sense, you could call that freeing the gesture in the stone or uncovering it. In terms of clinical work, what Freud meant was not imposing your own ideas on the patient. He also meant, at least originally, removing symptoms by uncovering what was repressed. These days, we might also think of freeing up certain capacities in the patient, though the analogy is not all that direct. Now I want to be more specific about what happens for me in the reverie that is part of working with stone. This is really the heart of my talk. Things come into my mind in reverie, many kinds of things in many forms that I may decide to try to embody in the piece in some way. Of course, there's no rule that says I have to use everything that comes into my mind, just as there's no rule that says you have to interpret everything you are aware of to the patient. I mentioned gesture just now. something in the form of a bodily movement, and that's one example. Or a visual image might emerge, perhaps an image of what a part of the stone could look like, or perhaps an image that has no obvious direct connection at all with what I'm doing. Or a word or a phrase might come into my mind, evoked by some aspect of the figure emerging in the stone. The most basic form that my reverie takes in working with stone, and of course it might be different for other people, is a body reverie. It's generally movement images that come into my mind. By this, I do not mean a visual image of someone making a gesture. It's more an internal feeling or sense of the gesture. A feeling in what you might call my internal psychic body that's kind of on the border with my actual physical body. A word I sometimes use for this kind of thing is quasi-bodily or quasi-sensory. It's very characteristic of the aesthetic dimension of experience. When this kind of internal gesture image comes into my mind, I often also make the gesture with my hand. So there's a kind of external version of it as well. And of course, if I want to embody that gesture in the stone, I'm going to have to use my hand to do so. I may also run my hand over the stone as I work to see if it can follow the gesture in the stone now. There's something a bit paradoxical here. When a gesture comes into my mind, apparently I am imagining that the gesture, the movement, could be embodied in the stone so that it could be made by the stone in some way. Of course, a stone sculpture does not literally move. The gesture, the movement in it, is only implied by the form. Another way of saying this would be that as I form the sculpture, the piece becomes a kind of body, and the posture of that body implies certain forces of gravity and muscular tension that in a human body would give rise to or result from movement. And of course, that doesn't mean that the sculptures are pictures of bodies. There is another side to this stone as body experience that comes into play as well. It's kind of the reverse of what I've just described. If I'm contemplating the stone with that kind of reverie attitude, I may start to feel discomfort in what I am calling my internal psychic body. It is as though I'm empathizing with the stone as body by identifying my psychic body with it, and I may feel all sorts of psychic body sensations, again, on the border of concrete body sensations, that tell me that part of the piece I'm contemplating is not quite right. It, that is, the sculpture as I am identifying with it, may feel stiff or tight or lumpy somewhere, for instance. I may feel stifled, even almost suffocated. I think this too is a version of reverie. Again, it is ironic that a stone that is hard by nature could nevertheless feel too stiff, but it can. It's easy to see, I think, how this kind of discomfort in my psychic body could impel something to come into my mind that would resolve the discomfort. Perhaps a gesture that would feel more flowing, perhaps a moderating of a curve that would be analogous to slimming a lumpy place in a body. Would that it were so easy in a physical body. So there is an interplay between what is not right or not there yet and the reverie that inspires the further work. I think the analogy to this body reverie with patients is a receptivity to what people call the energetic level of what's going on in the room, what's sometimes called the music and dance of the clinical work. This involves things like the quality of the patient's speech or breathing, and how constrained or nuanced the patient's movements might be. Different people experience this differently, of course, but some of us, anyway, tend to feel it in some way in our own bodies and our own energy flow, and it may give rise to an idea of something we could say to address it, an interpretation. Now I want to say a few things about the words that may come to my mind in Reverie. They're a different matter. There are several different kinds with different functions. They may name the uncomfortable feelings I talked about a minute ago, the feelings I might have in identifying with a part of the piece I'm not satisfied with. Too flat, or too straight, or not deep enough might be the way I would formulate what I'm sensing. Again, what emerges in the actual reverie, I think, is the feeling of discomfort. Then I put it into words, the same way the patient tries to put into words the images in a dream or the nonverbal things that come into his or her mind. Words may also come into my mind in the form of working titles for the piece as a whole, and they sometimes end up being my title for the piece. These words tend to come into my mind by way of an association to a visual image. For instance, one of the pieces in the series you see projected is called Knossos because the top of it has little projections which reminded me of bull's horns, and that made me think of the frescoes of maidens jumping over bulls in the old Cretan culture whose capital was Knossos. You can see that this is a private train of associations. This is also why I think it's fine for people who have one of my sculptures to rename it. Sometimes I use these working titles or other phrases that come into my mind as a sort of guideline to reinforce the direction I'm trying to take the work. But at that point, we're not really talking about reverie anymore. Let's say, for instance, what emerges in my reverie is this phrase from the Threepenny Opera. Den der Haifisch, der hat Zähne. The shark, he has teeth. It's got Maggie Messer. There's probably some part of the stone I'm working on that is teeth-like. And if I want to bring out the teeth-like quality there, I might sing this little phrase to myself as I do so. It's a true story, right? Perhaps by making the teeth-like parts sharper and more pointed. In this case, the phrase came through reverie, but then I purposely repeat it as I do the work that the phrase implies. Something similar might go on in clinical work when through your attunement to the nonverbal energetics in the room, you might sense, for instance, an underlying resentment in a patient. But then you have to do the work of bringing it to the surface, if that's what you feel needs to happen. I want to return briefly now to the question how what I see when I contemplate the stone is related to what comes into my mind in reverie, and conversely, how what comes into my mind in reverie gets translated into the actual sculpture. On the face of it, this is pretty mysterious. Mental activity and a piece of stone are not very similar. I've already talked about how we each have a storehouse of experienced forms in our minds, and for various personal reasons, aspects of the stone call up some of those forms to meet them. And the other way around, this goes back to what I've said about gesture. How does this work? Let us say that what comes into my mind while I'm contemplating a part of the piece I'm working on is that internal, quasi-physical sense of a gesture, and it's a gesture, say, of curling over. I think you can fairly easily imagine that I could go to that part of the piece and work to get a similar kind of curling over to appear there. And sometimes imagine, by the way, that the stone is not stone but clay, so that it can be pushed around, as though I could push it so that it curls over. In reality, I can file it down until it takes that form, though some of the stone will then turn into dust in the process. But how do we know how to do that? As I said before, and I'll put it even more directly now, when you're making a stone sculpture, you're making a body. And we ourselves are bodies. We all know how to make bodies do things. We know how to curl over, for instance. And conversely, we know how something looks when it's curled over. The philosophers among you, I'm just thinking this now, might think about Merleau-Ponty and the chiasm of the seeing and the being seen and the touching and the being touched that is true of bodies. So we all know how something looks when it's curled over. So we chisel or file stone away so that a curling over starts to be visible. Basically, it's that simple. And if you work representationally, it's even more obvious that it's that simple. In clinical work, too, there's a very simple aspect that has to do with the fact that we're humans, and we know what it's like to be human. Though, of course, it gets quite complicated in other ways in clinical work that have to do, among other things, with words. Something I want to mention just briefly, as you've probably noticed looking at the photos of my work, there's often a lot of color in the pieces and sometimes different textures. I've been talking mainly about gesture and form, but color and texture are elements that get worked with as well. And Reverie plays a similar role in the process of working with them. Another thing that needs to be mentioned, but again I won't say much about it, you may have noticed that I've been talking mainly about working with individual parts or pieces, areas of a work in progress. What about the piece as a whole? First of all, what I'm calling a part could be any size at all. I could be looking at something very small with a zoom focus, so to speak, or something very large with many details in it that are in relation to each other. Eventually, of course, all the parts, however complex, need to work together in the whole. The whole is not the same as the sum of its parts, but the whole depends on the parts and on the parts in relation to each other. As I go along, sometimes what I'm contemplating with my reverie mind will be the whole as it is so far. And a similar process goes on. That sense of internal discomfort may arise, perhaps in the form of a sense of chaoticness or confusion or lumpiness. Hopefully something will come into my mind that may resolve that discomfort, and so on, just as is the case with the individual parts. The way I've been talking about free association and reverie suggests a kind of passive process, more oriented to receptivity than to purposeful activity. And that is true, but it's not the whole truth. Not only does the process of working through, or actually making the sculpture, using what emerges in reverie, take a lot of time and effort, but it also takes a lot of work in the sense of intentional effort to keep putting one's mind in a state of reverie when it has departed from it. It's a little like mindfulness meditation. When you notice your mind has gone off and you're no longer being mindful, your first job is to bring your mind back so you can be mindful of it again. One thing that can happen to me working with stone is that I can get frustrated because the process is so slow, especially the way I work with a lot of attention to detail and a lot of filing rather than chiseling. When I get frustrated, my ability to see the stone, that is to contemplate it in reverie, gets disabled. In that state of mind, I'm liable to do something I regret, the sculptural equivalent of acting out. And I have to let the stone be for a while, go away and come back later. To go farther, because reverie is not forced, it can sound easy, and this can make the whole process sound easy and trouble-free. But that's almost never the case. Usually I will run into trouble a number of times in making a particular piece. By trouble, I mean not just feeling tired or frustrated, but a place where I'm stuck, where the piece is stuck. Nothing seems right. What comes into my mind doesn't seem right. Some kind of breakthrough is needed. This is like an impasse or a stuck place in clinical work with a patient. Often what is going on here is that I have, in fact, had a fixed idea, maybe in the form of one of those working titles, an attachment to some way I wanted the piece to be, or to some particular part of the piece that I really like, but that just doesn't fit with the rest. In clinical work, we may call this collusion, or a bulwark or bastion, a blockage of the analytic process that gets formed between the patient and the analyst. How do I get past this stuck place? Something needs to happen to disrupt the fixed idea, challenge the attachment, and allow a fresh view. Perhaps I need to put the piece aside and come back to it later, maybe years later, literally. Sometimes what's needed is a kind of drastic or radical action. I often find myself turning the sculpture upside down or on its side and going on from there. Or some kind of violent gesture or action might come into my mind, chopping off part of the form or making a big hole in the middle. I don't necessarily translate such gestures directly into the piece, but they may be disruptive enough to let me look again with fresh eyes. In clinical work, these correspond to countertransference fantasies, sometimes enactments, sometimes acting out. The fact that each clinical session comes to an end automatically gives us an opportunity to reflect, but sometimes we also need the fresh view afforded by consultation. Listening to this, you may have been struck by how intimately the mind and the stone are connected in this process. You may also have been saying to yourself, what's the big deal about reverie? It's just the mental part of working on a sculpture. You're right on both counts, but it gets a little different as we come toward the end of the process. Because as the piece gets further along and starts to hang together, starts not to be so radically changeable anymore, starts in fact to be set in stone, what used to be in my reverie is now in the piece itself. There's that upward sweeping curve. There's the curling over. There are the teeth, etc. Now they're right there in front of me. The sculpture is coming to be a being in itself. It's not a human being, but it is made of psyche as well as of stone, because reverie, translated through my hands, has now gone into the stone. Where is reverie happening now? It seems funny to say this, but I think that as the process goes farther, the reverie seems to emerge more and more directly from the stone. At this point, much of what I do is oriented to bringing out what's appearing in the piece, making something more visible, more dramatic, setting off a part that needs to be more differentiated from another part, and so on. I'm helping the piece to become even more itself, so to speak. To some extent, this corresponds to the point in clinical work when the patient starts doing a lot of their own work, and we are more or less supporting and reinforcing it. At this point, too, I can work on the stone in my mind without it being physically present, like when we talk about turning something over in your mind, that is, contemplating it from different angles. And of course, you can do this with patients, too, not obsessing about them, but contemplating them in your mind and paying attention to what you notice. The end point of this whole process, the point at which I consider the piece finished, is when, at least in my eyes, it really has become a thing in itself, and it doesn't need me to work on it anymore. At that point, it feels quite separate from me, and what comes into my mind when I contemplate it is now for me rather than for it. I would like to end by saying a bit about what it is that motivates me to make sculpture and what I get from it. What I have to say about this is somewhat different from what Sabah said, but I believe it is probably ultimately similar. What this is clearer for me with sculpture than with clinical work. Certainly there are many rewarding and many pleasurable aspects of clinical work. There's a tremendous sense of grateful achievement when a patient makes a breakthrough of one kind or another, for instance. And free association and reverie are pleasurable in themselves, especially when the process of self-discovery becomes freer, and when one's evenly hovering attention partakes of the patient's increased freedom and pleasure in the process. But still, for me, it's more clear-cut with sculpture, and it's very specific. What motivates me to make sculpture is a kind of curiosity, a sort of non-physical hunger. There is something I would like to see and touch, something I would like to have existing in front of me that is not the same as anything that already exists, something new that doesn't exist yet. I can't even imagine what it is, but I know that if I make a piece of sculpture, this is what will happen. Something I could not even imagine beforehand will now exist. And once that thing exists, what do I get from it? Walter Benjamin once said that the work of art reflects back at us that of which our eyes will never have their fill, can never have their fill. The desire is to create something that will have this effect. Whether a piece of sculpture is weird, ugly, or disturbing, if it has come to be a being in itself in the way I have talked about, then it can be looked at and looked at. And remember that a piece of sculpture is three-dimensional, and the number of angles from which it can be looked at is infinite. It can be looked at, and it seems as though my eyes can never have their fill. Thank you.